For 23 years, a Texas crime lab analyst sent innocent men to prison with fabricated forensic evidence, while the system meant to catch him looked the other way. In a Texas crime lab, there was a man whose job was to find the truth, innocence, or guilt decided by the numbers on his clipboard. For 23 years, he told courts exactly what they wanted to hear, and not a single person in power thought to question it, until one man's DNA made the impossible undeniable. The forensic evidence that condemned him was fabricated. Forensic science became courtroom gold in the 1980s and 1990s. Juries stopped looking at defendants and started looking at lab reports. One analyst's word could undo 12 alibi witnesses. Prosecutors built entire cases around a single strand of hair, a blood spatter analysis, a fingerprint. The defense had no way to fight back. Challenging forensic testimony required expertise they couldn't afford. He had the credentials, training from respected programs, certifications that filled entire pages, colleagues who called him thorough. Court transcripts show his testimony was always precise, always confident, always conveniently supporting the prosecution's theory. But confidence isn't evidence, and credentials aren't honesty. But there was one case buried in court files for years that would eventually expose everything. A defense attorney stumbled on a blood typing result that didn't match the crime scene. She flagged it. Nobody listened. For 3 more years, the analyst continued testifying until post-conviction DNA testing made ignoring the contradiction impossible. He didn't need to destroy evidence or create elaborate forgeries. He just adjusted numbers, mislabeled samples, and changed conclusions to match predetermined theories. A 1 in 4 match became a 1 in 10,000. Trace evidence that wasn't conclusive became definitive. The changes were subtle enough to survive casual review. And Texas courts never looked twice. In Texas courtrooms, forensic analysts occupied a space most defense attorneys couldn't penetrate. They were called neutral experts, which meant their word was treated as fact. Judges rarely questioned lab methodology. Prosecutors never challenged results that supported their case. This uncritical trust wasn't just naive. It was the permission structure that made decades of fraud possible. When a man sits on death row, the state is asking to take his life. The least we owe him is certainty. But what happens when the evidence used to condemn him was manufactured? When the expert testimony was theater? Meet Robert McClure, or rather, meet the man whose case would unlock a door investigators never wanted to open. Robert McClure was convicted based largely on hair analysis. The analyst testified it matched hair found at the scene. 21 years later, post-conviction DNA testing proved the hair wasn't McClure's and might not even belong to the actual perpetrator. One case opened a door. What investigators found behind it would shake Texas criminal justice system to its foundation. When investigators began reviewing the analyst's old cases, the numbers became obscene. It wasn't one bad case, one wrong conviction. It was a pattern spanning 2 decades across multiple counties. Rape cases, murder cases, assault cases, men in cells who had been sentenced by numbers that never existed. But the analyst wasn't working alone. He was working inside a system designed to catch exactly this kind of misconduct. So why didn't it? Supervisors received internal reports noting irregularities as early as 1997. They attended meetings where concerns were raised. They chose silence every single time. Prosecutors built careers on this analyst's testimony. His results were reliable in the way that made winning easy. Some DAS offices received tips about problems with his work and buried them. Defense attorneys had no idea they were fighting fabricated evidence. The asymmetry was deliberate. The people who could challenge the analyst had every incentive not to. Most defense attorneys in Texas felony cases are overworked and underpaid. Independent forensic experts cost thousands of dollars most clients don't have. The system that trusted this analyst's work without question refused to pay for anyone who might contradict it. Justice wasn't blind, it was financially colorblind. From 1990 to 2013, this analyst testified in over 400 cases. 400. How many men are still in prison based on his lies? How many families never knew the evidence against their loved one was manufactured? The scope wasn't just disturbing, it was criminal enterprise masquerading as science. Breaking down the flagged cases by conviction type revealed something damning. The falsifications weren't random. They consistently favored the prosecution. Exculpatory evidence was adjusted down. Inconclusive results were made definitive when they helped convict. This was systematic bias, embedded in the very numbers. Scientific fraud. with a prosecutorial agenda. Original witness statements often contradicted the forensic conclusions. Victims said the attacker was shorter. The analyst report said height was consistent. Witnesses described attacks differently than the physical evidence reconstruction suggested. The analyst wasn't just testing evidence. He was rewriting evidence to fit theories that had already been decided before the crime scene was processed. When authorities finally launched a formal review in 2013, they faced an impossible task. Hundreds of cases, many from decades earlier, evidence degraded or lost, witnesses dead or unreachable. They were trying to unbuild what one man had spent 20 years constructing, and they had no map of the original architecture. But the analyst left a trail. Internal memos supervisors filed and forgot. Emails between him and prosecutors describing a very different version of events than what appeared in court transcripts. Most damning, a suppressed 2002 report, never shared with defense attorneys, that documented specific concerns about his methodology. The evidence of fraud was sitting in filing cabinets the entire time. The memos were unambiguous. Supervisors documented problems with the analyst's work. As early as 1997, they noted inconsistencies. They flagged concerns. They did nothing. For 16 years, the men who could have stopped him chose silence. Every year they stayed quiet was another year of fabricated evidence. Another year of wrongful convictions they could have prevented. Documents obtained through public records. Requests revealed something worse than negligence. Some prosecutors were informed of concerns about the analyst's work and continued using his testimony anyway. They won cases they knew were compromised. They obtained convictions they knew might be fraudulent. The cover-up had participants, and those participants are still in office. By the time the review was complete, the number was staggering. Over 100 convictions were flagged as potentially compromised. Drug cases, property crimes, but mostly violent felonies, rape, murder, assault. The analyst's specialty was the cases where the state sought the longest sentences, and some of these men were still in prison. Freeing an innocent person isn't as simple as finding new evidence. It requires post-conviction DNA testing, independent forensic review, court hearings, prosecutorial cooperation, or at least the absence of active opposition. It requires money, lawyers, experts, and time. For men who'd already spent a decade or two in prison, the process moved like cold honey. Joseph McCarty spent 14 years for a rape he didn't commit. His conviction relied entirely on hair analysis. When DNA finally proved his innocence, he'd lost his father, his youth, his entire understanding of how the world works. They told me I was a monster. Then they told him he was innocent. They never explained how he became a monster in their system. Texas officials acknowledged the scandal with carefully worded statements about legacy issues and process improvements. They promised reforms. Some reforms came: independent accreditation requirements, new disclosure protocols, token changes to oversight structures. But nobody went to prison for what was done to these men. Accountability remained theoretical. This wasn't just one bad analyst. It was a system that made one bad analyst possible. The same features that enabled 23 years of fraud still exist: prosecutors who profit from convenient evidence, supervisors who face no consequences for silence, defense attorneys without resources to challenge anything. The specific vulnerability was patched. The structural vulnerability wasn't. Organizations like the Innocence Project became essential because official channels had failed. They ran the DNA tests. They found the internal documents. They argued the court cases that official innocence commissions wouldn't touch. Every exoneration came from outside the system that created the wrongful conviction. The reforms that followed included mandatory case audits, required analyst certification, and new discovery rules demanding labs disclose all test results, including contradictory findings. But implementation came slowly, applied unevenly, and contained exceptions that worried experts. Change was real but incomplete. Justice was partial. Here is what they don't tell you in the official statements. Men in Texas prisons convicted by this analyst still haven't been fully reviewed. The review process is voluntary, underfunded, and dependent on the same prosecution offices that used his testimony. For some of these men, justice may never arrive. Texas wasn't unique. Other states had other analysts: Colorado's crime lab, Baltimore's forensic units, crime labs in California and New York. The pattern was consistent: trusted experts, uncritical systems, delayed discovery. Forensic fraud isn't a Texas scandal. it is an American one. The system that sent innocent men to death row was the same system trusted to correct its own mistakes. Prosecutors who won with fabricated evidence now control the review process. Supervisors who knew for 16 years still have their pensions. The analyst faces professional sanction, but not criminal charges. That contradiction never really changed. If we can't trust forensic science, if we can't trust the oversight meant to keep forensic science honest, then what are we actually doing in courtrooms? What justifies the state's power to take freedom, to take decades, to take life? For the men still waiting in Texas prisons, for the families still seeking answers, this story isn't fully resolved. And until the structural failures are addressed, it won't be.